Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to talk about protocols and infrastructures. I'm a control systems engineer by formal training and worked on distributed optimization and robotics problems. These days, I do a lot of economics. Some of the most recent work in the Web3 space has involved crypto economics and the distribution of incentives. But today, I'm going to talk more about institutional economics and cyber physical systems because I feel like that's the nice register to build up from for DePIN. So with that, couple definitions. So start off by sort of providing the canonical definition of an institution. It's humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. That probably sounds a little bit familiar. We do a lot of that around here, actually. The definition of infrastructure is basic physical and organizational structures and facilities like roads and power supplies needed for the operation of society and enterprise. Also weirdly similar to the previous one if you stop and think about it for a moment. And then protocols. And I picked this definition from the Internet Policy Review and kind of squashed it a bit to fit it on the slide. But we have a cascade of formalized standards or agreements which predictably structures the behavior of data and objects to participate in infrastructural networks. In other words, the bottom one kind of helps us make the top two. And in fact, to make those things reliable and stable and useful. So I'm really interested in making things useful. And here I like to just highlight the fact that in order for something to be reliable, it needs to be both useful and persistent. And the way that we get there is by ensuring that its function or its behavior is something that actually helps people do an actual thing in the world, and that the structure is stable enough that property persists. If it's useful and not persistent, well, that's going to suck because you're going to try to use it and it might be great and then it's not there and it's gone and you just stop using it. On the other hand, something that's persistent but is not useful for anything, well, frankly, who cares? Maybe the people who provisioned it for you, but it won't last that long if nobody's there using it to help sustain it. The question this brings up, though, is useful for whom? And I think this is an interesting area with regards to the broader kind of Web3 and crypto economic space, is that we're actually trying to question useful for whom and to engage the production and the consumption groups as ideally, in some cases, the same group, or at the very least, creating more opportunities for aligning incentives between these two groups. So for the purposes of kind of my own take on DePIN, I'm going to break this down into two categories of behavior, although as Mark mentioned yesterday, I've also done some work, I guess almost 8 years ago now, on three-sided markets. For the moment, I'm going to talk about the difference between behavior and technology and between consumption and production. So on the top side of this diagram, we have the things that your DePIN network makes possible. So that can be additional technologies, and that can be behavior. And this goes back to the structure function thing from before, right? We build structures that have stable or reliable behaviors, and that allows us to build other structures. But it also forces us to engage in activities, to actually maintain things, to operate things, to use things. And so this view basically says, well, on one side, you have enabling technologies that are the technical dependencies that made it possible to build that network, and you have the enabling behaviors, which are the various activities that go into operating and maintaining those technologies, which in turn allow you to form networks. And those networks in turn provide the basis, the technical and operational basis for other activities. And so things stack up nicely like in Mark's diagram, right? You can layer over layer over layer if these things plug together. Caveat being that in practice, we're also going to see differences in incentives. And so the note on the side about long-term viability is that as a rule, costs are borne further down and benefits are realized further up. And so you need mechanisms for coordinating basically the sharing of the costs and benefits in a way that produces not just the initial bootstrapping, but also like a long-term viable system. And I think we'll come back around to some of the more token economics conversations in the panel coming up. But for the moment, I'll just remark that There's a big difference between bootstrap incentives and long-term resource distribution. Like, you very well may have network effect businesses where it doesn't make sense if you don't have enough coverage, or at least enough coverage within a particular geographic area. So you have to bootstrap the supply side, you need to bootstrap the operations activities, and cross a threshold before you can demonstrate usefulness, and that may involve upfront capital. But on the other hand, the long-term sustainability of the operation of that network can't be dependent on perpetual minting. And I guess, again, in the crypto sense, we have a tendency to write these like long-tailed minting functions that can work well as subsidizing initially, but that are actually going to undermine the long-term stability of a network. Eventually, you have to tie something into an economic productive modality, and again, you have to channel that value back from the side where benefits are realized. So one of the lenses that I brought up today was cyber-physical systems. I tend to take this as a primary lens for a lot of my work, having come from a robotics lab. It's a little bit harder to read on the screen than I expected, but there's a clickable concept map at cyberphysicalsystems.org. If you get a chance to look at it, I recommend it, because the definitions of all of these individual terms also pop out and are explained. And the thing I like about this is, it identifies and handles the fact that there are humans in the loop. We're not ignoring the non-deterministic or strategic actors here. We're accounting for technical aspects, including both the cybersecurity ones, as well as the kind of more traditional physical systems aspects, dealing with validation and verification and computer-aided design, and we're also acknowledging the breadth of application domains. And so, as a general rule, you can find yourself on here somewhere. I tend to gravitate to the part that's in yellow and orange there. So I run a firm called BlockScience. It's a systems engineering firm, and I usually have to define systems engineering. This is the official definition from INCOS. I usually say it's the worst way to design complex systems except for all the other ways. It's obviously very difficult to do design work, validation, operationalization in real-world settings, but this is what the institution of engineering actually emerged for. These kind of recursive and iterative, yet formal and stable approaches to creating complex systems. And so I think it's important to emphasize that engineered systems include people, products, services, information, processes, and natural elements. And in particular, with distributed systems and decentralized networks, we're really attentive to the services, information, and processes part, which maybe aren't always incorporated as explicitly into a design specification for a large system. Though I would argue that in general, they're incorporated into infrastructures in the traditional sense. If you look at civil engineering, the aspects of maintenance and ongoing considerations are part of the design in many cases, the institutions that maintain those systems. So I tend to cartoonify it. We have ideation and conceptualization, do a lot of that in Web3. Requirements and design, not as much. Jump to implementation and testing. Operations and maintenance, sure, we pay lip service to it, but we don't often provide the same level of attention to it. And I think just evening this chart out and putting effort across all of these boxes can go a long way to stabilizing some of our distributed systems. I'm not going to read this whole diagram to you, but it's a reminder that this sort of engineering design process is also a protocol. It's a set of practices that allow you to incorporate your requirements, do architectural level design, evaluation, and iteration. It's an iterative protocol. And this is important because in a lot of these systems, especially when crypto economic incentives are involved, there's a little bit of a white paper mic drop moment, and then there's not a lot of opportunity to adjust or change, whether that's because of investor incentives or whether it's because of end user incentives. It can become very difficult to iterate on your designs, especially where those designs are related to the economic incentives or the rules about how to participate. Those things end up being structural in the people and processes part of your distributed network, but because there's so much weight on them and there's so many stakeholders, they quickly become untenable to adapt and change, and that's where we get into some of the DAOs and decentralized governance questions. And for my part, I tend to lean on the institutional economics field for this. I have a colleague, Eric Alston, who's written quite extensively, both in the traditional world with the sort of constitutional scholarship, as well as in DAOs and decentralized governance. For my part, because I run an engineering firm, I follow this sort of agilified version of the engineering process. We have our narrative models. That's the kind of white paper sales pitch moment. That's what creates the expectations or gives people a sense of what to expect. You have engineering models, so formal requirements, specifications, simulations, analysis, trade studies, what you need to do in order to basically check the story. Like, is this feasible? What will it take to do this? What are the real costs? And to be honest, with the Goddard example from Mark's talk, I think a lot of really important things happened in that green box that fed back on the narratives that led to the formation and the exercise of the capacities of the institutions in question. So if you just told stories, it might sound good for a while and you might get a hype cycle, but eventually it's not going to work. If you actually reconcile those stories against reality iteratively, both sort of through formal models and through implementation, realization, and feedback, you eventually can accomplish pretty amazing things. And I think this is the stage that we're at in our particular field, is that we're going through our first pass, maybe our second. For DePIN, it's 3, maybe 4 years at most. For crypto broadly, we're in, I think, the 15-year range. And that basically means that we're just making it around this loop a few times and starting to make sense of it. And my invitation is for people to look a bit more at engineering more traditionally, and I think that fits nicely with Mark's point, for the protocols and practices for developing infrastructures, and the fact that many infrastructures were quite distributed because they were physically distributed. So yes, amassing the capital was more centralized. Yes, the engineering effort was more centralized, but the physical implementations were often extremely distributed by virtue of the physical distributed nature of physical infrastructure networks. And so I do think there's a lot that we can learn from the existing engineering field. So as I mentioned, I'm a control systems engineer. Here's a kind of cartoonish version of literally every control system. We've got our sensors. They give us information about the world. We've got our estimators. We form beliefs about the world, because it turns out the sensors aren't actually the information we needed. They're just the things we can actually measure. The estimators construct our canonical representation, what we actually believe to be true. And of course, that changes both because the state of the world changes and because our sensors are noisy and our systems are imperfect. But then we're able to use those estimates of the state of the world to sort of understand what our desired outcomes are. And I kind of carve in the goal setting here to be clear that you can actually update your goals as a function of your estimate of the state of your beliefs. And so you're trying to align through human oversight and validation the representation of the world that you have constructed with your experience of the world, what you get from kind of outside. And so this feeds forward onto our controls, which is our decision-making policies, which in turn write to or send messages to our actuators, which do stuff. Do stuff affects the world. Loop runs indefinitely. And you can use this sort of canonical representation for, frankly, just about any decision problem. I did quite a bit of operations research and sort of business-focused controls work over the years and have found this to be very helpful there as well. But now we're doing protocols, we're doing distributed systems, and we don't want a centralized control plane necessarily. We don't want our goals coming from a single actor at the tip of a hierarchy. We want to have a coordinated effort by many people, and this starts to feel weirdly like a political science or institutional economics problem, because now we have this highly sensitive feedback loop here in terms of the participation and preferences in, quote, governance. That's going to happen by way of something called secondary rules. These are rules about rules. Now, you need to have enough adaptive capacity here to adjust to changes in operating environment or new learned information, but you also have to have enough stability that this system is reliable, right? We talked about it before. If it's changing too much, people aren't going to trust it. They're not going to use it. So you have to be able to preserve adaptive capacity while also not becoming thrashy. And I think this particular bit ends up being a real challenge in the Web3 space, because on one extreme, we get things that are noisy and thrashy, almost kind of Silicon Valley startup-wise, where you can pivot every 2 seconds. Can't really do that with a large stakeholder group or a large group of people who need to have buy-in with a decision. On the other hand, if you don't have the ability to make a change in response to new information, you're probably not going to be able to adapt to the level of kind of variety in an emerging field. And so if we work backwards from that piece and say, okay, well, assuming that we can come up with a sufficiently balanced, hey, we have a mechanism for making a legitimate change, but it's not particularly easy, and ideally it's slow enough not to thrash the system, fast enough to handle the variety we're facing, well, then now we're dealing with things like iterating on protocols that might be managed by within a Git repo, within like an EIP-like process. But still, it provides a lot of decision-making authority for actors in context. So one of the biggest differences between this diagram and the previous is there's a loop there on the lower right, that actors are no longer being constrained to a single controls action, but instead they're being provided a set of constraints, a set of rules. As long as they don't violate the protocol, they can do what they want. And the effort to align comes from a mix of the constraints and an incentive field that's overlaid within those admissible action sets. And yet we still need sensors, and we still need some measure of common state. And something like a blockchain provides the basis for a common canonical state. And you can also use other systems in the kind of controls and robotics realm. You might have a canonical state that's too rich to be on a blockchain, but you could still use a hash or to make a reference to it canonical. You can also have distributed state where there's local canonical state, and the only thing that is in a global record is information about how the local states are related to each other. Again, that's helpful for constraint enforcement. One mathy slide. Please tolerate this for a second. It's a recent paper by myself and my colleague Alain Ben-Mer on protocols and institutions. This is a kind of control theoretic variation on the institutional design problem. It takes influences from Ostrom, Stafford Beer, and a few other sources, but basically it maps a institutional design problem onto the canonical controls problem and focuses on the fact that rules in form are not equal to rules in use, and that we're emphasizing constraint-based control rather than asserting a pattern of behavior. So in a like classical controls problem, you would assert G, and here we're actually only asserting U sub X is a subset of U, where U is all of the things you could do, and U sub X is the things you're allowed to do when you are in state little x. And that gives you a set rather than an instruction. And so that's the equivalent to acting in protocol. The cool thing about that is that you can actually start to derive policies that can induce properties. And again, I guess sort of 2018, I wrote my first proof that, for example, some of the properties of Bitcoin have this nice stability property where you get things like no double spend rules, even though they're only enforced locally, can provide global properties. This generalizes quite nicely. And so you get these stable properties that are, we can call them regularities in behavior, that are induced by a mixture of constraints, and then from constraints, and then within those constraint sets, you can further coordinate through other incentives. So just keep in mind that you can pretty explicitly control constraints. Incentives, at best, you can only kind of control. Because even if you induce incentives over the set of actions, people always are going to have other exogenous incentives. But as long as you're able to enforce constraints, then even if they have external incentives and would act differently than your incentive profile might induce them to, they still can't break the core rules. And so leaning more heavily on the constraints and less on the incentives as a baseline, and then only viewing the incentives as an overlay on top of that. This gives us a constraint-based structure where our networks have these systems of relations or interaction patterns encoded in protocols. The sort of open system is the socio-technical system where there are agents. They could be human, they could be machine, they could be assemblages of human and machine, they could be corporate. It doesn't really matter, because as long as they're interacting by way of these protocols, then that set of systems and relations is enforced. Any properties that emanate from the constraints rather than from the incentives ultimately undergird the properties from the previous math. So I've been doing a lot of my work lately in this constraint-based way, and if some of you are interested, that paper on protocols and institutions builds on earlier work on generalized dynamical systems, which are dynamical systems models over non-numerical state spaces. Just about done. Sorry, this is kind of long. So bringing this back together, we get our nice stacks. I sort of compressed the stack a little bit from what Mark shared, but I've used this slide for a while. we've got data and state and physical resources at a low level. Then we have the sort of beginnings of our information systems, sensors and actuators, affordances that are associated with human actors. So that's your interface. Then you start to have the specific decisions, the actions, the events, the observations that are made possible by those sensors, actuators, and affordances. We organize those things into patterns through protocols and rules and norms. That's where you start to get your structuring, your persistence, and finally you get these networks, systems, institutions, large-scale systems that we abstract away, that the people who are not necessarily participating in them can still recognize them as existing parts of our society. And so we accomplish that through coupling of structure and behavior, structure and function. And so at least in my work, we look at the infrastructures as the provision of the structures and the organizations as the kind of behavioral units, again, including distributed organizations, caveat being that when you patch these things back together and ladder them up, you actually need both. They show up in pairs. You need both the structures and the behaviors in order to get this kind of useful, stable, reliable object. So last 2 slides, takeaways. Thinking about infrastructure from a more institutional economics side, we want to acknowledge that they're partially non-rivalrous. That means they tend to grow in value as people use them up to the point where they become congested. Caveat being that you can generally add infrastructure on the supply side and reduce that congestion. They have input for downstream activities, which means they are by definition enabling. Their point is that like you make them in order to enable a diverse and often pretty multi-stakeholder system. You don't generally build infrastructure for a single thing. Infrastructure supports a wide array of often unknown a priori activities. They produce spillover benefits. That just means they produce positive externalities. It means there can be benefits beyond the immediate benefits. Generally, you maximize social value through non-discriminatory access. I tend to connect this to the kind of permissionless narrative in Web3. And then the congestion and congestion control strategies, again, common in the infrastructure literature. Here, that's going to tie back around to the protocols, the economic incentives that I was talking about earlier. It's not good enough to have a strategy. It needs to be an effective strategy for the specific set of resources, technical and organizational, that are required. So it's not good enough to just have a protocol. You need to have a fit-for-purpose protocol that's suitable for regulating the specific kind of congestion that emerges within that particular infrastructure. Last slide. Cyber-physical system side of this, kind of going back to our concept map. So we're explicitly human factors in the loop. So this extends to agents because agents are still effectively the agents of other humans acting, at least ostensibly, on their behalf. But in either case, this gives you this kind of open world model where you really can't assert what the actors are trying to accomplish. You can really only induce a particular cost or benefit for a particular preferred action. If you want stable properties, you really need to rely on the constraints. Hence the second bullet. We have technical systems that can structure outcomes without imposing specific decisions, and physical infrastructures are also great examples of that. We have modified the set of actions that are possible, not dictated the actions that people will take. This is even true of the tunnel. The other thing that I'm very prone to emphasize is dynamic. So not static snapshots of these systems. Most of the properties that we care about have temporal elements, and that means sort of safety or reliability can be viewed as a continuous control problem, the stabilization of a dynamic property, not just a snapshot statistical measurement. And so you need more than just static state in order to do this. Haha, static state. You need dynamics. And then finally, we accomplish our stability through the layering of technical assurances. These are the properties of, for example, a blockchain, or of a particular sensor network, or of a particular tool with the basically human behavior layers. So we end up having rules and norms, and the communities that you build in order to operate, maintain, and govern these infrastructures get layered together. And they need to be complementary. Like, it doesn't make sense to have norms that don't mesh with the technical assurances of the tools at hand. But when we're building up to network scale systems, we need to make sure that we're accounting for economic incentives and technical assurances and community norms and basically everything that you need to ladder up to a functional system. And I think to many of the other points, I guess yesterday evening, this also rolls up to being able to do things like negotiate with a corporate partner, as was in the example of Helium and others, that even if you're a distributed network, you may need to empower groups of people with authority to act on behalf of the larger group in order to engage in certain operational and economic practices. And that is the end of my talk. See how I did on time.
Well, thank you. I think we have some time for some questions. Are there any questions? If not, there are. Okay. Do you want to just? I can bring you the mic.
Obviously, there's a big challenge between bringing a blockchain-based piece of infrastructure into the real world. One of the things I think you alluded to a little bit would be like regulation, right? So when anything here, you're going to hit straight into governmental regulation because infrastructure is so important. It's not like, oh, it can fail, or you can have different state actors. Like even that is based on who owns part of the blockchain. You're gonna have these types of questions. I've seen this in countries in Central and South America and things like that, where the government's not got a big of control. But in Western countries especially, there's a lot of control around infrastructure. What's your experience with that, and how have you kind of navigated that with the work you've been doing?
Yeah, so I mean, part of what I'm sharing here is informed by this. So I live in the US. I've met with US regulators in the past in a couple different sectors, but more financial than anything else. And the big takeaway that I had from those conversations is that, like, they have a set of rules that exist for the purpose of inducing stable, reliable infrastructure. And so if you ignore them or say, hey, well, we don't like the current implementation of financial infrastructure, kind of screw you, then you're not going to get along very well. But if you go and actually try to understand which rules and protocols and implementations and try to, I'm not going to say re-implement, but at the very least represent some of those things. And so a caveat here would be most of the, in an engineering literature, we can distinguish between like a functional architecture, a logical architecture, and a physical architecture. Think of the physical architecture as the description or blueprint of how it's implemented. The logical architecture is like the protocols and rules, and the functional architecture describes the behaviors that those rules are meant to create or to fulfill. And so if you dig in a little bit and you find the functions and see, okay, match them up, and you dig in a little bit and you say, okay, well, you use these logics, then yeah, in a lot of cases you're swapping out the physical layer, but if you can describe how either your logics implement those functions, or better yet, how your implementation is matched up to the logics that they already have as kind of an initial step, you get a much better response. Because the way that I see this is like you're showing them that you're listening and that you've paid attention and that you understand their function in the world, which again, that was my experience with regulators, is that if you show up and you clearly have understood why they exist and aren't just saying you don't know how to do your job, then they want to talk about it. If you don't sound like you've done the work and understand why and how they got to be where they are, then they're going to be kind of dismissive.
Maybe let's go to this side. I don't know which one was first of you. But
Please go ahead. Oh, sure. It seems like in your slides, you there is a relationship between, let's say, the requirements that you talked about in the beginning and the constraints that you define later, or that you bring up later. How has the take-up been in, let's say, the developer community to almost spend more time really figuring out the requirements, which seem like underlying that is the constraints, and then really integrate that into the protocols?
I would say the uptake is less than amazing. I've had some very good, I've had some very good experiences, but they're the minority. For the most part, a lot of things get decided prematurely, especially in like the Web3 space. And again, this is I think of this as an incentives issue. What ends up happening is you have to make really strong assertions and claims so early in your process that people couldn't have possibly done the measure of, like, you know, building and testing and learning that you would need to have robust requirements by the time that they're expected to assert their designs. And a big part of the way that at least I try to teach this is I say, like, design isn't what you think it is. Design is actually recursively refining your requirements until there's like one thing left. It's not sitting down and like, imagining it. Like, that's called conceptualization, ideation. That's great, you can do that. That is not design. Design is the process of taking that idea space and recursively breaking it down until it's actionable, it's implementable, and you have a set of criteria to evaluate it against. And this is where requirements come in. And one of the big takeaways is that, like, if someone hands you a design and they ask you to assess it, and there's no requirements to assess it against, you can't really assess it. Like, you need some set of goals, metrics, criteria with which to evaluate something. And so, we see a lot of designs put forth, again, in the Web3 space that are approximately make number go up, instead of, hey, we want to produce a reliable functional infrastructure that performs this activity in this region over this time scale. And the kinds of requirements that you would normally expect in an engineering application are more like SLAs, they're service level agreement type requirements. They're like, can you perform this activity on an ongoing basis? Like, what's your uptime? What's your response time? And we don't do a lot of that in this space, though I think it's a matter of maturity. I think as we go through these first couple cycles and people build stuff and learn and things fail, or in some cases there is an opportunity to iterate, then we'll recapture that as, hey, actually, we need to accomplish X, Y, and Z, and we'll find ourselves designing against those requirements and evaluating against those requirements. But this is more of a hopeful statement for me. I haven't seen nearly as much of that as I would like.
Okay, so this would be a bit of a follow-up question to the constraints. So on your slides, you made it a bit sound like you're very focused on getting the constraints right, and then it sounded to me, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that the incentives are the cherry on top. Now, coming from economic design, usually as soon as you model any kind of economic interaction, of course you want to have constraints so that people can't do any malicious actions, but you still need to elicit preferences to allocate resources efficiently and fairly. And you still need the incentives there so that people have an incentive to give you the right preferences. So I can't really see how only via constraints you can come to an efficient and fair market outcome by viewing incentives only as the cherry on top. Because in the end, there will still be enough freedom no matter what constraints you have.
So this is partly the difference between economics as a field and control systems engineering. So, like, you tell me you want to design for efficient and fair market. First of all, you can't write an expression of what efficiency means until you have a state space, until you have a dynamic system that can change through time within that state space, and then you can describe a subspace in that state space, which you characterize as the sets of behavior that are fair or efficient. And so if you want to achieve an efficient and fair market, you need to have a world model with laws of motion and admissible action. So you've already specified constraints and the way it evolves through time. That induces a space of possible sequences of activity. And then the efficient and fair market is characterized by a subspace in that space. And so you can actually attack that problem as a constraint-based problem with an invariance principle within the subspace that you've defined as an efficient and fair market. It's a hell of a lot easier to design protocols that satisfy efficient and fair if you do it from an invariant-based derivation approach than if you try to do some sort of like guess and check, like, what if we gave people this? Like, frankly, like, it doesn't work. Like, from a, again, design perspective, like, even if you want efficient and fair market, if you actually read the literature on mechanism design problems have to work backwards from like spaces, admissible actions, and the constraint sets. And then you need to encode your resource allocation rules in such a way that those invariances are preserved under all valid sequences of actions by the participants. So you can still do it. It's just that that piece of the puzzle, if you try to do it before the state spaces and the admissible actions and the trajectories, inevitably frankly, I don't think you can make strong claims that you've achieved the properties that you're claiming that you achieved. But people do that in economics. It's just a pretty small subset of the economics field that does rigorous market design and mechanism design.
Thank you.
Okay, let us thank again the speaker maybe. And also,